Let's talk about the Millennial Rain. It's one of those topics in biblical prophecy that can feel really complex, maybe even a little confusing. But what if there's a surprisingly clear way to understand it, hidden right there in the text? Today, that's what we're going to do. We're going to break down exactly what this 1,000-year kingdom is all about.
So it all boils down to this one big question. Does the Bible actually describe a literal 1,000-year kingdom right here on earth, with Jesus Christ physically ruling as king after he returns? That's the core idea we're going to unpack together.
All right, so let's get a solid definition on the table. The millennial reign is a future 1,000-year period where Christ isn't just some kind of spiritual influence. No, he's a physical, governing king on planet Earth. It's a very specific era, happening after his second coming, but before we get to the final eternal state.
Now, you might be asking, why 1,000 years? Where does that number come from? Well, the scriptural bedrock for this is Revelation chapter 20. In that one chapter, the phrase 1,000 years shows up 6 times. And according to the sources, when the Bible repeats something like that, it's a huge signal that we're meant to understand it as a literal amount of time.
So here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to start with what the millennium is, and then we'll look at a really important key for interpreting prophecy. After that, we'll apply 5 simple tests to see how it works, explore what the world will actually be like, figure out who's going to be there, and finally, wrap up with why this whole thing matters so much theologically.
First up, what exactly is the millennium? To get to the bottom of this, we have to go straight to the source, and that is the 20th chapter of the book of Revelation.
This is where looking at the original Greek is super helpful. It just adds so much clarity. The word for thousand here is hilia, and it points to a literal number. For reign, the word is basileo, which means to actively rule like a king, not just have a symbolic influence. And when it says Satan is bound, the word is deo. That means literally tied up, imprisoned. We're talking about a real restriction of his power, not just a weakening of it. So that brings us to our really crucial piece of the puzzle, the interpretive key. How do all those incredible prophecies in books like Isaiah and Zechariah fit into this timeline? Well, the sources give us a simple but really powerful rule to follow.
The key rule is actually pretty simple. The New Testament, specifically the book of Revelation, gives us the timeline. It lays out the sequence of events. The Old Testament then comes in and fills in all the rich descriptive details of what those events are going to be like. So think of the New Testament as the skeleton, and the Old Testament is the flesh that gives it all its form. It's the framework that makes sense of everything.
And here's that timeline in action, laid out nice and clear. Revelation 19 describes Christ's visible, powerful return. Right after that, chapter 20 details the 1,000-year reign. And then, chapters 21 and 22 describe the final eternal state. See? It's a clear, sequential progression, with the millennium sitting as its own distinct phase right in the middle.
Okay, now let's actually put this key to work. The sources provide what you could call a simple litmus test for prophecy. 5 key questions that help us identify exactly which passages are talking about the millennial kingdom.
These are the 5 tests. First, is death still around or is it gone? Second, what's up with Satan? Is he active or is he restrained? Third, is the nation of Israel central to what's happening in the world? Fourth, is righteousness something perfect and natural, or is it being enforced? And finally, are the blessings conditional, or are they absolute and final? These questions help us put every prophecy in its proper place.
And this table is great because it shows you exactly why these tests are so useful. For example, let's take death. Right now, in the church age, it's common. In the eternal state, it's gone forever. But the millennium is unique. Death is still present, but it's rare. Same thing with Satan. He's active now, totally removed in eternity, but he is specifically bound and restrained during the millennium. This period is completely distinct from the world we know and the heaven that's to come.
So, if we take that interpretive key and apply it to the Old Testament, what kind of picture starts to emerge? What is life actually going to be like during this 1,000-year reign?
Honestly, the descriptions are incredible. We're talking about universal peace, a deep, holistic well-being the Bible calls shalom, where nations literally beat their swords into plows. The whole earth will be filled with an experiential knowledge of God, called Dot. People will live extraordinarily long lives. Jerusalem will become the center of global worship. And justice, well, justice won't be a slow, flawed process anymore. It will be immediate and perfect, enforced by Christ himself.
This all leads to a really important question. Who is actually on earth during this time?
The answer to this helps solve a lot of the potential confusion about how things like sin and perfect righteousness can exist at the same time.
So, the sources identify three distinct groups. First, obviously, you've got Jesus Christ, the King of Kings. Second, you have resurrected saints, people with glorified immortal bodies who will reign with Christ. And importantly, they are incapable of sinning. But then there's a third group, mortal humans. These are the people who survive the events leading up to the millennium and enter it in their natural bodies. They are the ones who will populate the earth, and they are still capable of either obedience or rebellion.
Okay, so this brings us to the big why. Why does any of this matter? Our last section digs into the theological purpose of this kingdom. It's not just some footnote in prophecy, it actually serves a really profound purpose in God's entire story.
Theologically, the millennium accomplishes some huge things. It's the ultimate proof that Jesus isn't just a savior, but the rightful king of the whole earth. It fulfills very specific literal promises that God made to Israel and to the nations. It also serves as the final test case, demonstrating that humanity's core problem has never been our environment, but the sinfulness of the human heart. And finally, it's a public vindication of God's perfect justice before all of history comes to a close.
This quote from the source material really sums it up perfectly. The millennial kingdom isn't the final destination, but it is the final chapter of history as we know it, a transitional kingdom that prepares the entire world for the full arrival of eternity.
And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. What does a kingdom of perfect justice, ruled by a perfect king, where rebellion is still possible? What does that ultimately reveal about our nature and about the final purpose of all of history? It's a question that really gets to the very heart of this entire topic.